Chapter 7. The Puritan Experiment. Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1630. The wind off the Atlantic carried the scent of salt and pine. 11 ships anchored in the bay. The great migration had begun. Among the passengers was Elias Layton, son of John Layton, a quiet man of 30, with his father's thin frame and ink-stained fingers. He carried little besides a chest of books, a compass, and one battered ledger that had belonged to his father. Elias had not come for gold or for trade, but for faith. The Puritans spoke of building a city upon a hill, a society ruled not by kings or companies, but by the covenant of believers. Yet as Elias watched Governor John Winthrop proclaim the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he heard echoes of his father's voice, "No man should rule by memory alone." He was soon appointed record-keeper for the General Court, the governing body that combined church and state. There he saw a new form of order emerging, not imposed by company charters, but born of moral governance. Each week, ministers and magistrates debated laws on fasting, church attendance, and Sabbath enforcement. They believed divine law must be civil law, yet they still wrote everything down with a precision that would have made John Layton proud. He recorded it all: the first town meetings of Dorchester and Salem, the Body of Liberties, 1641, the first written legal code in New England, the elections of magistrates by free vote of the freemen. It was paradoxically both a theocracy and a democracy. The colony was strict, dissenters were punished, Quakers banished, but for the first time in the New World, ordinary citizens had a voice in written governance. One night, by the fire, Elias copied a line from the court records into his own journal. "Every township shall keep a book of all orders made in public meeting, that posterity may know the reason of our laws." It was the same idea his father had died believing, that order must have memory.
Chapter 10. The Bureaucrats of Empire. By the early 1700s, English America had grown from a desperate outpost into a sprawling network of colonies, each with its own assembly, council, and courts. But now came a new question: how to govern them all together? In London, the Board of Trade and Plantations was established to oversee colonial affairs, the first centralized administrative body for America. They demanded regular reports from every governor, population counts, trade statistics, lists of council members, copies of colonial laws. And who wrote these reports? Not the governors themselves, but clerks, men like the Laytons, who had multiplied across generations, serving as secretaries, scribes, and comptrollers from Boston to Charleston. Their letters crossed the Atlantic every few months, carrying the lifeblood of bureaucracy. An account of tobacco exports for the year 1707. A table of militia numbers by county. Minutes of the Assembly concerning the repair of highways. Tedious as it sounded, this exchange of paper became the circulatory system of the British Empire, and ironically, its greatest vulnerability. For in recording every law, tax, and grievance, the clerks also recorded the birth of discontent. They wrote down the protests against royal vetoes. They copied petitions for local autonomy. And they kept copies, quietly. Nathaniel Layton's grandson, Isaac Layton, serving as clerk in the Virginia House of Burgesses, began compiling what he called the Record of Rights, a personal collection of colonial laws defending local authority against royal overreach.
In it were early versions of phrases that would echo later in American history. Taxation by representation is the natural right of the English subject. The liberty of assembly shall not be abridged. The bureaucrats had, unknowingly, become the Revolution's archivists. Chapter 11. The Gathering Storm. By 1750, the administrative network of British America was vast but brittle. Every colony had its own governor, assembly, and charter, yet all were bound by the same invisible web of paperwork: orders from London, receipts, patents, oaths. But these structures, designed for obedience, had also taught the colonists how to govern themselves. Elias's descendants, now scattered from Massachusetts to Georgia, held positions in every branch of local government: clerks, recorders, even assemblymen. They had mastered the art of governance and were beginning to question its master. When the Stamp Act of 1765 required that every official document carry a royal stamp, Isaac's son Samuel Leighton wrote in his diary, "They have taxed not our goods, but our very words." It was not rebellion yet, but the realization that paperwork itself had become political. Assemblies protested, petitions flooded London. The clerks who once served empire now served the cause of independence, smuggling copies of resolutions between colonies. Samuel's final recorded entry, dated 1775, reads, "My great-grandfather wrote that order must have memory. Now we fight that memory should be free." Chapter 12. The Invisible Architects. When independence came, it was not just soldiers and statesmen who built the new nation. It was also the quiet writers who knew how governments were made. The Continental Congress borrowed directly from colonial practice. Assemblies modeled on Virginia and Massachusetts. Written constitutions inspired by Pennsylvania's frame of government. Financial accountability drawn from Maryland's ledgers. Even the U.S. Constitution echoed phrases from early colonial codes: due process, trial by jury, general welfare. And though the name Leighton appears nowhere in the founding documents, their influence lived in every line of written law. When the first federal clerks began organizing the records of Congress, they used the same methods first practiced in Jamestown: numbering acts, filing by date, preserving every debate. They did not know that they were completing a circle begun 170 years earlier, when a frightened young man had first opened a ledger on the muddy banks of the James River. Epilogue: The Quiet Republic. In the National Archives in Washington, D.C., there exists a small leather-bound book, brown with age and faintly marked on the spine: Record of Orders, Virginia, 1607. Inside, in faded ink, is a line written in 17th century script: "Let every order, every judgment, and every freedom be written, so that no man may rule by memory alone." Beside it lies a note from an anonymous archivist written in the 1930s. This volume represents the earliest surviving record of English governance in America, its author unknown. But if you turn to the final page, just visible beneath the stains of time, one signature remains legible: John Leighton, Clerk, Virginia Company Settlement, 1607. And thus the story of America's administrative birth, the evolution from rule by command to rule by consent, ends not with kings or generals, but with clerks, pens, and ledgers that refuse to forget.
This is where the story transitions from colonial order to national governance, following the legacy of the Leighton family. Clerks, administrators, and quiet architects as their philosophy of written law and accountability evolves into the structure of the United States government. This section is written to be surprising, deeply informative, and emotionally resonant, showing how boring bureaucracy became the hidden foundation of democracy. It continues seamlessly from Part 2 and brings the total narrative length to over 10,000 words. Part 3. The Republic of Records. Chapter 13. The New Clerks of Liberty. Philadelphia, 1789. The summer heat pressed down like a weight on the city. In Independence Hall, beneath the same roof where revolution had begun, the work of building a government was underway. At a small desk near the door sat Thomas Layton, a quiet man in his 30s with meticulous handwriting and a habit of dipping his quill too often. He was the great-great-grandson of John Layton, though few knew it, and one of several assistants appointed to record the first sessions of the First Congress of the United States. Each day he copied debates, resolutions, and draft laws. He watched as James Madison proposed amendments that would become the Bill of Rights, words that echoed his ancestors' ideal. Let no man rule by memory alone. But Thomas saw something new as well, the deliberate effort to institutionalize freedom, to make liberty itself administrative. There were debates on everything: how to number the laws, how to record votes, how to preserve archives, even what to call the president. To many, it was dull bureaucracy. To Thomas, it was sacred architecture. He wrote in his journal, "Our revolution is not complete until its laws are written, ordered, and preserved. A republic without records will soon forget what it stands for." Thus, from chaos and rebellion emerged something more lasting, the machinery of democracy. Chapter 14. The Architecture of Order. Washington City, 1800. When the federal government moved from Philadelphia to its new capital beside the Potomac, the city was barely built: swamps, half-finished roads, marble walls rising out of mud. Among the first to arrive were not generals or politicians, but clerks. They came with trunks of parchment, record books, and ledgers bound in leather. Among them was Thomas Layton, now appointed Assistant Secretary in the Treasury Department. His office was a small room in a half-finished building, but he carried with him a vision that America's strength lay not in its armies, but in its ability to remember itself. He oversaw the cataloging of federal accounts, the creation of standardized forms for revenue and customs, the first official Federal Register, lists of laws enacted by Congress. Each task seemed mundane, but it formed the invisible skeleton of governance. One evening, as he worked by candlelight, President Thomas Jefferson passed through the hall. Seeing the piles of ledgers, Jefferson remarked with a faint smile, "So this is the Republic laid out in ink?" To which Layton replied, quietly, "Yes, sir, and it must be written before it can be lived." Chapter 15. The Paper Republic. Washington, 1830. Half a century after independence, America was growing faster than its records could keep up with. New states, new laws, new offices, each demanded order. Thomas's son, Henry Layton, now served in the office of the Clerk of the House of Representatives. His job was to record every vote, every speech, and every amendment introduced on the floor. The House chamber roared with debate, slavery, tariffs, expansion. Yet amid the clamor, Henry wrote steadily, believing, as his ancestors had, that words mattered only when preserved. He devised new methods. Journals indexed by subject for the first time. Cross-referencing of statutes between state and federal codes. The use of carbon copies, a new invention, to ensure no record was lost to fire or theft. When questioned why such tedium mattered, Henry answered, "Because every generation forgets. Records are how we remind them." During his tenure, the National Archives were proposed, a place to house the growing sea of paper. It would not be completed in his lifetime, but his notes laid its foundations.
Chapter 16. The War of Records. Washington, 1861. The Civil War began not only as a clash of armies, but of administrations. When the Union fractured, so too did its record-keeping. Two governments, each claiming legitimacy, each producing its own documents, laws, and proclamations. In the chaos, Henry's grandson, William Layton, was appointed to the Record and Pension Office of the War Department. His task was monumental: to track enlistments, casualties, and pensions for millions of soldiers. He worked in rooms stacked to the ceiling with ledgers. Every page told a story of sacrifice, names, regiments, causes of death. After the war, he helped compile the official records of the War of the Rebellion, 128 volumes of reports, correspondence, and orders, the most extensive documentary record of any war in history. When a visitor once asked if he ever tired of paperwork, William smiled sadly and said, "Every line here is a life. Every entry restores the dead to memory." For him, the bureaucracy of war was not cold, it was sacred. It gave permanence to loss and form to chaos. And when the Union rebuilt, it was those records that made pensions possible, boundaries clear, and justice measurable. In keeping track of the war, they had kept the nation itself intact. Chapter 17. The Bureaucracy of Democracy. Washington, 1901. The new century brought telegraphs, typewriters, and a federal government more complex than anything the founders imagined. Clara Layton became one of the first women employed in a federal clerical office, the Department of Commerce and Labor. Her handwriting was perfect, her sense of duty unshakable. She believed, as her family had for centuries, that the written word was the true lifeblood of governance. She filed industrial reports, labor statistics, and the new immigration records pouring in from Ellis Island. Each folder represented a life: a miner in West Virginia, a seamstress in Chicago, a child worker in Massachusetts. Clara saw the American story unfolding not in speeches, but in forms, every entry a fragment of democracy. When the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire killed 146 workers in 1911, her department's records provided the proof of safety violations that led to national labor reforms. She wrote in a private letter, "Our ledgers are not cold, they are the conscience of the nation." Chapter 18. The Age of Machines. Washington, 1945. The Second World War transformed bureaucracy into an engine of survival. Records became faster, vaster, and more secret. The federal government now employed hundreds of thousands of clerks. Among them was Daniel Layton, Clara's son, serving in the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA. His role was to index captured German documents, decoding the machinery of a fallen empire. What he found haunted him. Millions of files, meticulously kept, recording the extermination of entire peoples. It was proof that bureaucracy could serve evil as easily as good. After the war, Daniel helped draft the principles for the Freedom of Information Act, insisting that no government should hide behind its own paperwork again. He wrote, "When power writes in secret, freedom erases itself." His work marked a turning point, the transformation of record-keeping from mere administration to accountability. Chapter 19. The Age of Machines. Washington, 1989. By the late 20th century, filing cabinets gave way to databases. Margaret Layton, Daniel's daughter, worked for the newly computerized National Archives and Records Administration, NARA. Her task was monumental, to digitize 2 centuries of government records before they decayed. Day after day, she scanned faded documents, the Declaration of Independence, Civil War rosters, the early census rolls. And as each page appeared on her glowing screen, she felt the pulse of her family's legacy. She often thought of her ancestor John, hunched over his candlelit desk in Jamestown, writing by hand what she now preserved by laser. When a reporter once asked if she found her work boring, she laughed softly. It's not boring when you realize every democracy depends on memory. If we forget our records, we forget ourselves. Chapter 20. The Last Ledger. Washington, 2025. In a quiet office of the National Archives and Records Administration, a young intern named Emma Layton begins her first day. On her desk sits a glass case containing a single, worn volume, Record of Orders, Virginia, 1607. She runs her fingers lightly over the faded leather. The curator tells her it's one of the earliest surviving records of English administration in America. Author unknown. But Emma knows. In her family, the story had never been forgotten, passed down through centuries of clerks and archivists, the tale of John Layton, the man who first wrote that no government should rule by memory alone. As she begins scanning the fragile pages, she reads his final entry. We came to make profit, and found instead the making of a people. Outside, Washington hums with the noise of a digital republic, databases, servers, the endless stream of electronic records that govern a nation. Emma smiles and opens a new document on her screen, labeling it simply Layton Ledger, Generation 21. She types the first line. The health of a nation still lies not in its crops, but in its order. Epilogue. The Immortal Clerk. 4 centuries had passed since a small group of men built a fort in the Virginia wilderness and struggled to survive. Their tools were crude, their motives mixed, profit, faith, survival. Yet amidst it all, one quiet clerk had done something extraordinary. He had written things down. From those first entries, rations, punishments, orders, grew the vast administrative tree that sustains the United States today. Every law, every liberty, every right recorded owes its lineage to that single act, the belief that memory must be made permanent. John Layton never imagined his name would vanish while his idea endured. But perhaps that was the point. He had built not a monument, but a method, a way of preserving justice through time. And so 400 years later, when the lights of the National Archives glow in the night, when servers hum with the digital heartbeat of democracy, his spirit remains, unseen, uncredited, but alive in every document, every law, every word that keeps the Republic remembering itself.